What we have here is a declassified post-mortem of a project codenamed Genesis. Now, its failure wasn't just bad. It was so total, so absolute, that it forced a complete rewrite of how things are done. So today, we're going to deconstruct exactly what went wrong, why it was doomed from the very start, and, what happens when scientific arrogance collides with incomplete data.
Okay, let's not bury the lead here. This was the final verdict, a catastrophic operational failure. The asset, codenamed Big Ben, was mentally unstable, physically misshapen, and just completely useless for its intended purpose. The project didn't just miss its targets, it actually created a significant liability.
And this slide, well, it really says it all. When the analysts evaluated the asset's operational viability, the number they came back with was 0. Not 1%, not 0.5%, an absolute 0. Uncontrollable, unpredictable, and totally useless. So how does a project fail this completely? That's really the core of what we're going to dig into.
To really get it, we need to kind of reframe the whole thing. This wasn't some accident or just a stroke of bad luck. The reports are crystal clear. This was a predictable catastrophe. The failure was a scientifically certain outcome baked right into the project's DNA from the moment it was conceived. Let's find out why.
This one quote from the lead investigator just gets right to the heart of it. Methodological hubris. That's the central theme here. The failure wasn't because of a lack of resources or talent. It was born from pure institutional arrogance, this belief that they could somehow shortcut creation and just plagiarize a past success.
To understand the failure, we have to go right back to the beginning, the project's flawed blueprint. This is where the first, and honestly the most critical mistake was made.
You see, Project Genesis was never about innovation. Its entire purpose was to replicate this wildly successful program called Project Zarathustra. The goal was basically to clone a masterpiece. But the architects just fundamentally misunderstood what that would take. They weren't creators. The report literally calls them mere plagiarists.
And here it is, the critical point of failure, the smoking gun. The team went ahead with what the official report calls exclusively incomplete notes from the original Zarathustra files. I mean, they were trying to build a god from a shadow, a stable being from partial, misunderstood data. They were building on a foundation of dust.
This warning, which was pulled from one of the analysts' notes, just says it all. The team saw an outline of a success and just assumed they had the full picture. That single act of procedural arrogance guaranteed a fundamentally broken creation process before a single dollar was even spent.
So this flawed blueprint, it led inevitably to what they call a deterministic failure. Now we're going to look at the direct consequences of that foundational error, the massive, massive chasm between what the project was supposed to do and what it actually did. The mandate was clear, and it was incredibly ambitious. They wanted to forge a uniquely British superhero, a national icon, defined by 3 things: exceptional power, unwavering loyalty to the state, and being the embodiment of a classic, heroic archetype. That was the dream. And this is the reality. A total inversion of every single objective. Instead of a powerful superhuman, they got a physically misshapen creature. Instead of fierce loyalty, they got mental instability. And instead of a hero, they created a subject trapped in a systemic delusion. The chasm between intent and reality wasn't a gap, it was a universe apart.
Let's just break this down side by side. The intended heroic archetype became a mentally unstable subject. The powerful superhuman was instead saddled with a deeply entrenched, non-negotiable delusional framework. And that fierce loyalty? Gone. Replaced by a mind so lost in its own fiction that the asset was deemed operationally useless. A total failure across every single metric you can imagine.
Now, this slide gives us a really crucial insight. The asset's crippling delusion wasn't a malfunction. The report calls it a necessary and inevitable structural support. His psyche was so broken by the flawed creation process that he literally could not bear the truth of his own deformity. The delusion was a cognitive survival mechanism.
But the disaster didn't stop there. Initial failures, they really exist in a vacuum. They often become the engine for their own escalation. Creating a useless asset, that was only stage 1. It created the preconditions for something far, far worse.
The first step was this official reclassification. The subject, Big Ben, was no longer considered a failed asset. He was deemed a significant liability.
This wasn't a neutral failure, like a dud firework. This was an entity that, just by existing, actively worked against national security interests. This slide shows the final, terrifying transformation. So you have this compromised structure, right, born from those incomplete notes that left the asset uniquely vulnerable. The trigger was an unexpected moment of compassion, which just shattered his engineered psychological structure. This collapse allowed him to somehow pierce the veil of Maya, bypassing his flawed design and resulting in a completely uncontrolled metamorphosis.
The entity that emerged from that was no longer Big Ben. It was something else entirely. No longer delusional, but described as tragically and permanently aware. This was the final, uncontrolled apotheosis, the ultimate consequence of mistaking a shadow for a blueprint.
So, what do you do after a failure of this magnitude? You learn. The only remaining value of Project Genesis was as a brutal cautionary tale. Let's look at the new governance protocols that were codified directly from the ashes of this catastrophe.
The post-mortem really distilled the entire collapse into 3 core systemic failures. A failure of due diligence because they went ahead with incomplete data, a failure of risk assessment by not even foreseeing the consequences, and of course, a total failure of objective attainment. And from those failures came 3 new, non-negotiable protocols. First, mandate data integrity, making sure all source data is complete and verified. Second, independent auditing, which requires a third-party review before anything happens. And third, containment-first design, prioritizing stability and control over just raw performance.
This right here represents a fundamental shift in institutional philosophy. Going forward with incomplete intelligence is no longer a calculated risk. It's now officially classified as a procedural violation. This is the core lesson of Project Genesis, basically written into law.
And that concludes the official analysis from the declassified report. It's a stark warning against the dangers of hubris and a roadmap for making sure a catastrophe of this scale never, ever happens again. But this does leave us with a final question, doesn't it? Project Genesis failed because its creators mistook a shadow for a blueprint. It really makes you wonder, what unseen flaws, born from a similar kind of arrogance or just incomplete understanding, might be encoded into the complex systems that we all rely on every single day?